Okay, so welcome to the OLM Dev Working Group meeting. We have quite a number of things on the agenda today. Please don't forget to add your name and the company or project that you're affiliated with to our agenda, so we can keep track on our upstream community and how it grows. Thank you. First up on the agenda, I have an item regarding our upstream feedback. So sort of, I wanted to see if anyone in the community had any thoughts about how our meetings are structured, if they can be changed, if they should be changed in any way to help anyone, or is the structure we have now where we have basically alternating feature planning meetings at 10 a.m. Eastern on Thursdays, and this working group at 3 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays, sort of every week, if that's a good schedule for everyone. This is sort of the first pass at a schedule for our working group, and just wondering if there's any thoughts on if anyone has anything to say about the structure and whether they like it or not, because we can always change it. But if there's no feedback and that seems to work for people, then we'll continue with this structure. This just happened to be the first structure that we put in place.
Yeah, this is Chris. I think the structure is fine. I just think maybe we want to put maybe a little bit of a on the agenda, kind of maybe the suggested topic types that we want to put in there. So that the title of the meeting says dev versus feature planning. I tend to just flood it with whatever I feel like talking about, and then we just talk about it. So I'm not sure if that's really the intent, or if you want me to focus the things I ask for to be in a certain category.
Right.
I can do that.
Right, and I think broadly speaking, one of the things we do want to do, and this gets onto the next item in the agenda, which is we want to improve our issue triaging. So I propose we dedicate a portion of the time to one or both of these meetings to actually sort of groom the issue backlog and try to be more responsive, because we have some processes in place to try to address our GitHub issues, but we generally have a lot of emphasis on downstream bugs as well, and that kind of takes up the time. So we're making some improvements around that. So what I kind of think about doing is maybe spending some time in feature planning, since from what I've seen, that agenda tends to be lighter. We can spend that hour, if there aren't any items on the agenda, or maybe the last half of that hour, going through the GitHub issues that people want to discuss and triage them further, because I'd like to do that instead of adding another meeting to everyone's calendar. So that's an improvement that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, one of the things that the SDK team has been doing is weekly triages every Monday. That's where yes. I know we ended up splitting the meetings. So we have triage every week where we go through and assign all new untriaged issues to a milestone, backlog, or a release. And then the planning meeting, we go through just the current release and then the next one.
Yes, I mean, I like that. That's a good structure, and I think you guys get through the backlog really well that way.
And I think starting with your planning meeting first, doing it there, and then if you find that you do need another meeting, you could go towards doing that later. But I agree with you. First, try not having to add another meeting for a calendar, and especially if your planning is lighter, and just go through them. Your first couple will probably take a long time, just because if you haven't done it in a while. I think Eric has a nice little query in for the GitHub issues. We only go through whatever comes back from that query. And sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 20, depends. And that's the only ones we do. And just the purpose is this real? What's the label? Put it into the right bucket milestone. And then if we can, assign it and then move forward. Not to discuss each and every one of them, but just kind of like, where does this go? So, cool.
Yeah. Thank you for that. No, I know you guys, the SDK team does a good job with the issues. There's also some process improvements that I merged yesterday around the stale bot. We have different bots fighting each other and in GitHub issues, so hopefully that will also help with our backlog a bit. But yeah, I think let's try to use some time in feature planning then to address the GitHub issue backlog. Next on the agenda, we have our document some documents around our upstream release governance and how we plan to sync between upstream and downstream repositories of OLM. I don't want to get too much into the discussion, too much into the weeds right now, but I do want to share it with the group. I'll just share my screen briefly, just so people can see these docs. This is a PR on GitHub that Kevin put together. That sort of, it takes an initial stab at trying to solidify a release structure once we move entirely away from the downstream to the split upstream repositories. I think it'll be helpful for people to take a look at that if they're interested in that process. Basically, how many approvers do we want before we cut a release? How, do we want a time period before when we say we're going to cut the release and we actually do it? So it's an interesting little document. If you're interested in how we're going to actually cut upstream releases, then I would take a look there. And also Ankita put together a HackMD file, which sort of goes through how we plan to move between the upstream and downstream versions of the repositories as we do the split. And the split is coming the week after next. So sometime in February, we should be seeing the upstream downstream split. There's an enhancement on that available if you're interested in the operator framework enhancements repository. So feel free to take a look at these docs and yeah, and we'll discuss it more potentially in the future. So next on the agenda is OPM content management features PR status by Chris. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a PR that I think Ankita had submitted quite some time ago, and it looks like pieces of it. And there's some things that I was really interested in it, and so I was just wondering if there was if we wanted to take some time to clean that up and finish the pieces that are not done. Or I was just wondering if Ankita or somebody else had some thought on this one. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this one.
Yeah, I think this was Annick's PR. I'm not too familiar with what the content of this. We could get Annick to speak more on this.
I can maybe talk a little bit. Well, I don't know if I can talk to every single thing that's in there. I think I've read through this once or twice, but I think that there's probably some useful stuff that's in here. I don't know if anybody is actively sort of like tracking or attempting to clean this up or merge it at this point, just because I think a lot of our sort of community focus has been around, well, doing all these things in a very imperative way isn't, I think, where we want to spend most of our time. And so most of our effort has gone more into trying to do work on the declarative enhancement. Not to say that like there's nothing in here that wouldn't be useful, just that we sort of haven't focused on it. So obviously, if anybody's really interested in it or like wants to take ideas from it, I think there is some stuff here that was sort of implemented.
Yeah, if you look at my comment at the bottom of the conversation, I know, like, for example, deprecate truncate was carved out into its own PR. We're going to talk about that later. And I know that the RM -- packages option on OPM was also carved out into something else, or at least it was implemented.
Yeah, exactly. So I think this is probably in a state where it would need to basically be rewritten or at least cleaned up significantly if we wanted some of this stuff to get in. I don't think there's any explicit reason why we would prevent that from happening if anybody was interested in or wanted to write that up. But I don't know that there's anybody who's actively working on trying to get any of this.
So as we go through this whole issue triage, it seems like we almost have to do a PR triage too, right? So this is one of those maybe we want to tag as stale or, put in the backlog, or maybe close it, or not sure how you guys want to deal with that. So I get tangled up in all the PRs on what's real and what's not real.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I think we do have some automation that closes stale PRs. I don't believe it's enabled in the enhancements repository. We could double check that, but I think that is where the current state. Because you're right, there's a lot of very old cruft sitting at the bottom of this. I see an enhancement that was written all the way back in March of 2020. That's just been sitting there. March, April, May. Yeah. So we might want to just go through all of these and
Yeah, one of them's
mark all of
mine.
them as stale.
So I need to
Sure.
figure out what to do with that. So, yeah.
I
Okay, I
guess,
just wanted to bring it up as an issue. Yep.
yeah, well, while we're on the topic of the stale bot, I spent some time last week, I think, trying to go through a lot of the issues in operator registry, at least. And I found a couple of interesting things. One was that the stale bot interacted really badly with the OpenShift CI bot. So the stale bot would like attempt to close a thing and the OpenShift CI bot would reopen it and back and forth. And the other was that even stuff that had been marked stale and like should have been deleted if the bots were doing the right thing, really hadn't been properly triaged by anyone, myself included, which to me is not really the purpose of the stale bot. Like it shouldn't just be that no one has any time to look at anything, so everything just gets auto closed. I don't feel like that's the right model. So I'm not so sure that I'd be in favor of enabling the stale bot on more stuff, unless we come up, unless the group triaging that we're talking about here starts taking place and we can make some sort of a minimum SLO on issue reading.
Yes, I think we are working, myself and Kevin are working on trying to put together sort of what you're describing, like an SLO or a way to help manage the issues as they come in and slowly work our way through the backlog so that, hopefully in the future, everything gets triaged and then the stale bot doesn't have to have such an impact. But I'd say on the main OLM repository, we kind of are pretty far back. So we have to, we have to try to get to we have to get to the issues that are really affecting people, and not so much the issues that are just just old and not haven't been closed. That's a good point. That's a good point, Evan. So I think that proposal, I think we're pretty good on that. Let's move on to the next item on the agenda, which is from Chris and Jeff on OPM index deprecate truncate next steps. Chris or Jeff, would you like to go ahead and speak to that?
Yeah, I guess I can start. This is Chris, and Jeff can pipe in here. So you work on the same team, and we're trying to do is we now have this. We're now at this point where we've got some, false starts. We've got some operators that are some versions of operators that we'd like to get off the books that have been out there for a while now, and so we were interested in deprecating them. And so we reviewed the deprecate truncate PR, and we put we had an active discussion in Slack with the team about this. And it looks like that particular feature isn't really quite ready for prime time. So I guess there's two things. One, is there a plan to complete that? Or is that one of those, is this one that doesn't look like it's going to work properly at all unless it's completely redesigned? And then secondly, is there some guidance or doc on how we're expected to deprecate bundles, channels, and packages in general? There isn't really any documentation around that. I'm tempted to write something based on what I think it should be. But so we're evaluating this, and we're just looking for some guidance here. Where should we go with this?
I'm happy to speak about the deprecate truncate and the way it's being used right now by OpenShift, if that helps. Currently, it is not being exercised at all, but it's available for any operators that we find have older releases that would cease to work properly on newer versions of OpenShift in this case, but Kubernetes in the general case. So the idea is that if you have an operator package with 30 releases, and you're about to update to Kubernetes 1.22, which no longer supports v1 beta 1 CRDs, you can go back in your list of releases and truncate it at whatever the oldest one that has a v1 CRD in it is, and get rid of the old ones.
So
it's
Jeff,
kind of
yeah. So Jeff,
hammer.
did you find some quirks with that? I think you mentioned that somehow the graph gets truncated. So I guess maybe that's the point. So the graph gets truncated if you had like version 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and you deprecated 1.2, as it terminates the graph, it makes that the new origin, right? It makes for 1.3 the new origin.
Yeah, it helps you avoid the problem of if you have an index with a set of bundles, and if we didn't have this command, right, and you just said, I'm just going to rebuild this index, but with none of the older bundles, we do the validation that each bundle has any replacement that a bundle says should exist also exists in the index. So if you just truncate in the middle, you'll get an error that says, oh, you're missing a bundle that this one says it replaces, just as like a sanity check on the index. What the deprecate truncate does is it leaves the old ones in the references to the old ones in the index, but marks them all deprecated, so that if you have installed any of the old ones from a previous version of the index, you can still follow the update chain up to the point of truncation, and you don't get any errors when you rebuild the index with that data.
Right. Yeah, I do get that. So in our situation, the way we've built all of our taxonomies, except for one of our operators, every single one of them, the way we've designed them is we're using major.minor for channel names. And so there is no operator, so no operator version exists in two channels. It always exists in one channel. So basically it's, the sem versus skip patch pattern is what we're using. So every origin of a channel, so like 1.2.0 is the origin and has no replaces. But all of the every operator version does have a skip range. So that allows us to avoid, iterating through every single version within a channel, and it enables switching between channels. So that's how we're doing it everywhere. So we're trying to figure out what is the strategy. So it seems like this feature should work for us when we start wanting to disable entire channels or bundles, because we are using replaces and we are using skip range. So if you agree with that, then how do we complete this? So the completing it means I would like to use it on the registry part of the command line, not just the index part, because we use the registry part. We build the catalogs through Podman.
I think if I'm understanding the situation correctly, you probably don't have much need for deprecate truncate if you can just delete an entire channel of releases. Deprecate truncate is really when you have a single channel that you need to chop off part of in a new release of the catalog.
So if we deleted an entire channel, and of course all the bundles within that channel, and republished a catalog, and somebody had that already installed, because we're using skip range, that would automatically enable the upgrade scenario. Is that what you're saying?
Right, exactly.
Got it. Okay, so skip range got us out of jail here.
Yep.
Okay. So, all right, so we have an option. So have you given any thought to deprecating from the traditional scope of a deprecate, meaning you shouldn't use it versus you can't use it? Like some kind of, obviously we can use some document. So the problem with documentation is how do you back document a bundle that's technically immutable? So it's like we want to put a label on a CSV inside the index saying, yeah, the CSV is out there, this whole channel is there, but we really don't want to use it. This is deprecated, it's going to fall off at some point. Versus deprecate the way that you've described it is basically saying we're going to prevent installing with it, but will prevent upgrading from it when it replaces logic.
Yeah, we actually, that's a good use case, and we have a lot of the stuff in place for that already, but not all of it. So I would keep an eye on the declarative index config.
Yeah, okay.
Because one of the things that's for is not just for being able to declare the stuff in your index, but it's to be able to go back in time basically and annotate bundles with additional metadata. So one of the things you could do once we have the declarative index in place is go find all the bundles that you don't really want people to install anymore, add a little label to each of those entries in the declarative index that says deprecated, and rebuild the index. And then none of your bundle images have to change at all, but that metadata has changed in the index. And so when the resolver sees it, it knows not to pick those as options to satisfy user constraints. It's still in the index, so an enterprising user could go pull that and still install it if they really needed to. And like when I said a lot of this is in place, there is actually like a mechanism, all of the runtime mechanism for that is in place, including the ability to mark a bundle as deprecated. What's not in place is the ability to easily add that deprecated label to an existing published bundle. And that's where the declarative index config comes in.
I guess, Jeff, did I miss anything that we wanted to talk about here?
I think we got it. So if I understand right, for us, we'll just delete a channel when it becomes out of date or unavailable, and because we're using minor releases, that should happen often enough that we don't have to worry about OC or Kubernetes versions going out of date by the time we're there.
Yeah, so because we own the catalog,
Yeah,
we can rebuild it however we want. It'll be different for the OpenShift marketplace catalog. They'll have to have verbs, right, to remove stuff. That's not our problem.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, so thanks, Evan, for answering those questions around deprecate truncate. Up next on the agenda, we have Chris with is Semver and Semver skip patch fixed in OCP 4.6.z images. Chris?
Yeah, so back at the end of last year, I had tried using Semver skip patch, and it turned out that the list bundles API and the gRPC API was using the wrong tables and was manufacturing the data wrong. So you ended up getting this ugly error message indicating you had duplicate heads in a channel. And so they went ahead and I think, I can't remember who it was, I think it may be Ben Luddy or one of those guys, Evan might have been involved in it, fixed it. But as I'm trying to test it, we're using the downstream OCP 4.6 images as our runtime, because that's kind of the supported way we do it, and it supports multi-arc and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't appear that this fix is in there. I was wondering if you could confirm that it's supposed to be in there, or I see it's targeted. I get a little confused on how Bugzilla works. I know this is a downstream thing, but we have to use the downstream pieces for this. And so I wanted to find out how we get this in 4.6.
So I did some quick looking in the background while we were just talking. It's definitely in the 4.6 release branch. So I guess it depends if what you're still seeing is that same error, the found more than one head of channel thing.
Yep. Yeah, that's it.
So that is almost certainly because there's a mismatch between the version of the binary you're using to serve and the one that's on the cluster. So I think what you need to double check on is there's like a, when you use OPM, I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar with the binary image flag.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
I mean,
so I would.
So what I'm trying to use, I'm using, so I've learned all this stuff works. There's the OC release info, which allows you to figure out what the SHAs are for all of the images that comprise that version of OpenShift because they're not tagged for Z builds. And I tried to use, ultimately the image that came from that. So I'm trying to use that as my builder and my base image for the runtime. And it's still not working. So it could be I'm still doing something wrong.
Yeah, so I mean that fix is backported for sure. So if it's not working, either there's something wrong with images getting crossed, or there's still a bug there somewhere. I don't think there is. I definitely tested this a while ago, but I don't know. Maybe I missed something. So why don't we? I don't know if you have like some explicit replication steps of like all the steps you're doing. If you could send those over to me, I could take a quick look and see if there's still something funky going on or what.
All right, let me try harder. Make sure I'm not doing something silly on my side. But good. All right. So as long as I know it's supposed to be there and it wasn't explicit included, I will try harder.
Great. So next up, Alex is out on vacation, but he left us with a work in progress PR around some developer and contributor documentation. So I wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. The documentation that he provided is basically around enabling upstream users, everyone in this community, to more productively contribute to the code base. So there's some guidance here around reporting bugs and creating issues, how our contribution flow, sort of how our approval and LGTM approach looks like right now, as well as some guidance around related projects like the SDK, operator registry, operator API. So this is a helpful document. I think we're going to merge it soon, whenever it's ready, and then that'll provide some additional help for those who are actively looking to contribute to the project. So with that, let's move on to Evan, who has a topic on explicit properties enhancement. Evan, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to hold this for the feature planning meeting if we want, but since we have a little time, we have discussed having a good way to sort of pitch an enhancement and get the discussion going, and then have some sort of a timeline on when discussion happens and when it gets merged. And so I don't know that we've figured all that part out, but I figured I'd go ahead and pitch this enhancement that I wrote last week. So let me pull it up and I can share my screen to go over it. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so I will kind of quickly go over this. I think probably the majority of the review should happen in the PR, so it's recorded, but this is actually a piece of an earlier feature that we kind of dropped for time. And so I resurrected it as an enhancement so we could discuss it. Basically, we have it as an implementation detail of a lot of how the resolver works. We have these general properties that each bundle has. So each thing has a type and a particular value. And the way we parse the value is determined by the type. And it's also determined by the consumer that's parsing the type. So we have an explicit dependencies.yaml that looks a whole lot like this, where you say, here's my type of dependency, and here's the way I'm specifying my dependency. And the dependencies.yaml, this is a version range string so that you can depend over a particular range of versions. But most of the rest of this looks the same. So the proposal is to add a new metadata file to the bundle, which is properties.yaml, that would let you explicitly say what these properties are. or add additional properties. So canonical example would be something like a label. We actually, I mentioned this earlier in the call, but we have an OLM.deprecated property, and it would be really useful to include that as part of your definition of a bundle here as well, so that these properties get slurped up into the API that gets served to the resolver, and that gives you, as a bundle author, a lot more control over how the resolver sees your bundle and how it interacts with them. That's pretty much the extent of this enhancement for the most part. I kind of suggested what the way we would validate them and the way we might help scaffold some default properties. I don't know that that's necessary, because that's also something that could just be done when adding to an index. And then, yeah, these are the set of initial properties we should probably have, but there's not a lot more to it than that. And I don't know if we want to stop and ask any questions.
Just a quick question. So does this replace dependencies YAML? Since you do have dependency YAMLs things in there?
Yeah, so the distinction is dependencies YAML specifies like the query or the constraint over things that are properties. So when you're specifying, yeah, so Prometheus, yeah, exactly.
So this is a way to override what's in your CSV and plus maybe some additional things. Is that what this is?
More or less, more or less. These are, I mean, the other way of looking at this is that we are moving to models where like the contents of the bundle are less important, and we won't need to care so much that a CSV has a particular field. Instead, we'll rely on what the properties say instead. You know, for some probably long period of time, we'll still be deriving properties when you add them to an index. And if you take a look at the declarative index config proposal, it also includes a blob of properties. And then what I mentioned up here is that the current API that the resolver uses to pull data from the registry, from the catalog, is already includes a list of just generic properties that it interprets. So this is just giving bundle authors the ability to control and inject those properties directly.
So are you locked into a specific schema then? It's just basically a key value pairs essentially in string format, or? Because I know, for example, for dependencies YAML, you're going to be adding also constraints in there, like group constraints and things like that, which has kind of a nested kind of, and I see you've got kind of nesting here too.
So for the format here, the proposal is that there's a type that's a string, and it's probably good to call out that we should write out a schema here, but then a value that is just undefined. So if this is converted to JSON, any JSON would satisfy, because it's the consumer of OLM. It's the consumer, the resolver consumer, that understands how to read this type and know what the value means for this type.
Yeah, that's what I was concerned about. Is that value just a string that happens to, are you missing a little pipe to the right because it's actually a string, or is it actually an object?
It's actually any JSON type, or in this case, any YAML type. So down here, it's just a string. Here it's an object, and here it's an object.
So you don't have to register a property schema of any kind, then it's just free form, and it's up to you to make sure that you're just using the right kind. So you can extend it all. Can we just type in any random property we want here? Like if we did IBM dot something, we could do that.
Yeah, exactly. If you have some needs, and that's kind of what's interesting about this, is we can these will get persisted through into the catalog and into the cluster as well. So if you want to add your own properties and use that to do special processing or filtering of the catalog itself before you publish it, you're welcome to do that. And then like some of the other things we've been talking about have been to make the interpretation of these also pluggable on the cluster. So potentially you could define some IBM prefix labels that if you wanted to, and then also provide to OLM a way to understand what to do with those in the resolver layer. I think it's a little ways off, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility.
And again, Evan, maybe you said this, but these already land up in the API.bundle structure, that properties array of API properties. Is that what this ends up being if you were to do a get bundle kind of thing?
Yes, that's where it ends up.
All right. And they take precedence over something that would be in the CSV, is that?
Yeah, more or less. At least as far as the consumer is as far as the consumer of that API is concerned. So the resolver in this case would trust the properties over what the CSV says, because the resolver doesn't have access to the CSV until it's already picked a bundle.
Yeah. So you talk. All right. So you do talk all precedents. Okay. At the bottom of that paragraph there.
I think I threw a comment on this proposal at one point, but do we want to talk for a minute about something like the difference between first class properties and arbitrary properties? Like I guess it feels to me like there should be a world where certain fields are intrinsic to every bundle type, like a version field, for example, or something like a schema. I know that maybe that's outside the scope of this proposal, but it feels to me like if we want to have a definition of what properties look like, if you can assign arbitrary ones, that we need some sort of concept like that makes a difference between those two things, if that makes sense.
I think that makes sense. We've been talking about these in the context of a few other places as well, and I guess I'm slowly coming around to the opinion that it kind of makes sense to just have a list of properties of ultimately be what defines our bundle, and that includes things like the media type and the version even, because there's a lot of cases where it can make sense to have duplicated keys, for example. That's one of the implied restrictions of having a first class field, right? Is that when you take this list of key value pairs and you turn one of them into a property, like a first class thing, you have to pick a type for it. And so it's either going to be a list of values or a single value or something like that. And what's kind of interesting about leaving it as this list is that leaves it totally in the consumer's hands to decide whether it can handle multiple copies of the same property or not. So like OLM GVK, for example, a provided API, that's an example of one that we'd always have multiple copies. But there's some other interesting examples. Like one of the things that I originally thought was it would probably make sense to have a schema type, a schema entry property, I should say, that defines kind of what to expect in the rest of the property list. But even that is maybe not so cut and dry, because let's say we have a bundle schema that says I expect there to be like a GVK type or a bundle path type or something like that. If we go ahead and upfront say that's a single value, then that prevents us from doing something interesting in the future where let's say we also define documentation bundles, and documentation bundles just include like markdown documents for the operator. If we don't have a first class schema field, we could build quote unquote bundles that are valid both as installable bundles according to what the resolver needs, and also viewable doc bundles according to what the operator doc viewer needs. And we leave it up to the consumers to decide that, because we're not going to be prescriptive about what keys go in up front. That's kind of my 2 cents. I think it's definitely a conversation to have, but that's kind of why I'm coming around to maybe we don't want first class fields.
So effectively define a meta schema that we can work within, so everything is more flexible in the future.
I think this makes sense. I think it's important for us to recognize maybe that having that layer of abstraction is a burden on the end user, because like bootstrapping one of these things from scratch either becomes a process where we need some tooling that does that for them and makes certain choices, or some kind of validation software that makes it really easy for somebody to realize, like, hey, these are the bits I'm missing. Because I think that and just looking historically at what we've done, that's kind of the same problem that we have with CSVs, albeit like in a different form. I think there's some like perceived complexity there. Valid or not, it might be, worth it to at least explore what causes that sort of view from the community and how we can try to avoid it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like I don't think any of this precludes us from having well-defined, usable layers on top that spit out this a little more verbose format below, which we already do, right? We already have, that's what we have with the CSV, which has a schema and some top-level fields that get converted into properties when we add it to an index. So I think we have lots of options there.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So I'll throw it out as another example that I've been thinking about, because I've been looking at Crossplane a bit recently. A Crossplane, I don't know if you're familiar with Crossplane, but it's a system that sort of lets you build abstractions over cloud infrastructure providers, or really any sort of provider, but their provider abstraction is more or less, I think, just an operator, as from the OLM perspective. It's a controller that provides APIs, and other than a lot of them assume that Crossplane is already installed, there's really nothing unique about them from the operator's perspective. So it would be interesting to me to think about, I haven't talked to any folks from Crossplane, so I have no idea if this is a good idea or not, but it'd be interesting to think about a world where the packaging, the distribution, the resolver, the index concepts that we're building for operators are generic and useful enough that we could contribute them to other CNCF projects like Crossplane. So there's like 3 or 4 other projects in CNCF right now that all do packagey stuff, and that's Crossplane, Falcor, Helm, OPA has little bundles as well. So I think it's interesting to think about if it would make sense to build tooling that could also be used in those communities as well. And again, I haven't talked to anyone from any of those communities to see if anyone even cares. But it would be interesting to think about building all those tooling in a way that benefits all of those ecosystems and not just this one. And then to get to a specific example that I thought was kind of interesting is, it'd be kind of cool if you could build a Crossplane provider that is valid both as a bundle, that is valid both as a Crossplane provider in the Crossplane ecosystem and as an OLM operator in the OLM ecosystem. It was kind of like a concrete example of a case where we might want to interpret a single bundle in 2 different ways based on the consumer. Just food for thought. I don't know that that's really, I don't know that I would prioritize that direction over just meeting our needs right now, but it does seem like a lot of the choices we're making are making things generic enough that this could solve other problems in other communities, and it's worth at least thinking about the problem and maybe talking to some folks and see if it's something they'd be interested in collaborating on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I've heard some conversations about trying to collaborate with the cross-plane folks more. I know they did a presentation at the multi-tenancy working group, but it was around sort of the tenancy side of things, not so much the packaging side. But maybe we can see if we can invite them to our working group, to a working group call, or somehow share some information with them. That'd be great. And so with that, it looks like we've gotten through our agenda for today. Does anyone have anything else on the call that they'd like to bring up? Okay, in that case, I'll give everyone 10 minutes back. Thanks everyone for joining the OLM Working Group call, and hope to see you at another meeting. Future planning will be next week. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.